In a small house in a village outside Jerusalem, there is a sealed jar holding about a pound of perfume. That jar should not be there. The perfume is called nard, and the plant it comes from doesn't grow in Israel. It doesn't grow in Egypt. It doesn't grow in Syria or Arabia or anywhere a woman in that village could walk to. The plant, nard doste is jat mansi, grows on the slopes of the Himalayas in what is now northern India and Nepal, in thin mountain air, thousands of miles east of anything in this story. To get one sealed jar of it to a house in Bethany, somebody had to climb a mountain for it. Somebody had to dig the roots, press them into oil, seal the flask tight enough that the fragrance couldn't escape, and then move it across deserts and trade routes, by caravan and by ship, hand to hand for months. Every mile added to the price, and we know the price because a man in the room says it out loud. 300 dinar ei. In the parables of Jesus, one day of work in a field pays a man one of those coins. So 300 of them is 300 days of labor. Take out the Sabbaths, and you're looking at a full year of a man's income, sealed in alabaster, sitting in a small house in a village. Now stop and think about what that woman could have owned instead. For that money, she could have bought a field. She could have bought a small flock and lived off it. She could have bought a house outright, or fed that entire village through a bad harvest, or bought her way out of every uncertainty a woman without a husband faced in the 1st century. She could have held silver, which keeps its value and doesn't evaporate. Instead, she's holding perfume, a thing that exists to be used once and then be gone forever. Everyone who reads this story asks what she did with it. She broke the jar. She poured it out. She wiped his feet with her hair. 2,000 years of sermons on that. Almost nobody asks the other question. Where did she get it? Judas asks what it's worth. Nobody in that room asks where it came from. And John, who tells us the weight of it, and the kind of it, and the smell of it filling the whole house. John never says she bought it. Not once. But he does tell us something else about that night. And he puts it in the very first verse. This dinner is happening in Bethany, and there is a man reclining at that table who had been dead for 4 days, wrapped, sealed in a tomb, and mourned by everybody in the room. 6 days before Passover, in a house that had just held a funeral, a woman produces a year's wages worth of burial perfume, and Jesus is about to say one strange sentence about that jar. A sentence so broken in the Greek that translators still can't agree on what it means. Look at the container for a second, because the container tells you what kind of object this is. Mark says it was an alabaster flask, and that she broke it. That detail confuses modern readers, because we picture a bottle with a stopper. That isn't what this was. A flask like this was sealed, the neck drawn out and closed at the manufacturer, airtight, so the fragrance couldn't breathe out over the years. There was no lid. There was no way to take a little and put the rest back. Think about what that means. You cannot use this thing partially. You cannot open it on a good day and pour a small amount for a guest and reseal it for later. The only way in is to snap the neck, and once the neck is snapped, the clock starts. The perfume is exposed to the air and it will be gone. So a jar like this was never a household supply. It was a store of value. It was the ancient version of a savings account that can only be withdrawn in one transaction, for the full balance, one time, with no way to put anything back, and it comes in only one amount, all of it. Mark and John both make a point of the quality, too. The Greek phrase is nerdos pistike, and the usual sense of that second word is genuine, unmixed, not cut with a cheaper filler. This wasn't the household version. It was the real thing at full strength, sealed at full strength, sitting in a house in a village of maybe a few hundred people. Now, families did own things like this. That part isn't strange. In a world with no banks, no accounts, no paper money, wealth had to take a physical form. You held it as land, as livestock, as silver, or as something small and dense and valuable that you could carry in your hands and hide in your house. A sealed jar of imported nard was exactly that kind of holding. In many families it was inherited, passed down, and never opened by anyone for a generation, which is why the question won't go away, because if this was an inheritance, somebody in that family bought it once, on purpose, at enormous cost, and if it wasn't an inheritance, then somebody in that family bought it recently, which is worse, because then we have to ask what a household in Bethany was doing spending a year's income on burial perfume shortly before a man in that household died. John doesn't answer. John tells us the weight, the quality, the price, the smell, the room, and the name of the woman holding it. He never tells us how it got there, but Jesus says something about it. One sentence, 7 verses in, and inside that sentence there is a single Greek verb that I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video. The verb is te erho. It means to keep. Not to own, not to possess, to keep. To guard something, to hold it back, to reserve it for a later use. That's the word Jesus reaches for when he talks about her jar. Not, she bought this. Not, she brought this. She kept it. Remember that word. We're going to come back to it, and when we do, you're going to see that it is one of the most damaged sentences in the Gospel of John, and that the damage is the most interesting thing in the whole story. But before we can read it, we need to go back, because there was another body in this family, and there was another burial, and the text is oddly silent about something that should have been there. Go back 1 chapter. A man named Lazarus gets sick in Bethany. His 2 sisters send word to Jesus, and Jesus doesn't come. Lazarus dies. He is buried, and by the time Jesus finally walks into that village, John tells us the man has been in the tomb 4 days. Now watch what John does with the funeral itself. He skips it. We get the sickness, we get the message sent, we get the death, the 4 days, the mourners, the sisters, the tomb, the stone, and the shout that empties it. But the burial, the washing, the wrapping, the carrying, the sealing, John gives us none of it. He picks the story back up after the stone is already in place, so we never see what they put in that tomb. We only see what comes out of it. John says Lazarus walked out bound hand and foot, with grave cloths, with a cloth wrapped around his face, linen. That's all we're told, and here is why that matters. Later in the same gospel, John describes another burial in detail. When Jesus dies, Nicodemus brings a staggering quantity of myrrh and aloes, and John says they wrap the body in linen cloths with the spices, and then he adds a line explaining it. This is the burial custom of the Jews. John tells us plainly that spices were the custom. He shows us the custom being performed for Jesus. He does not show us the custom being performed for Lazarus. Then there's Martha at the tomb. When Jesus tells them to take away the stone, she objects, and the reason she gives is the smell. 4 days in, she says, and the odor would be unbearable. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of place where a video like this can slide from reading into inventing. The absence of spices in John 11 is not evidence that there were no spices. John is compressing. He skips whole scenes throughout his gospel and expects you to fill them in from the culture. And decomposition in a warm climate on day 4 will overpower any aromatic, no matter how much you use. Martha's line is not proof that the family cut corners at her brother's grave. So I'm not going to tell you the family failed to bury Lazarus properly. The text does not say that, and I don't know it. What I can tell you is that John, writing about this family, mentions burial spices exactly once. And it isn't at Lazarus's tomb. It's in a woman's hands at a dinner table 6 days before Passover. And there is one more thing John does that almost nobody notices. And it's in the 2nd verse of chapter 11. Before Lazarus is even dead, the first time John introduces this family to us, he identifies Mary. And he does it like this. It was that Mary, who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Hear that again. John is telling us who Mary is by pointing at something that has not happened yet in his story. The anointing is still a chapter away. The jar hasn't been opened. And John reaches forward, grabs that scene, and uses it as her name tag, which means that in the mind of the man writing this gospel, the jar and the tomb of Lazarus are not two separate episodes. They arrive together. He cannot introduce the sick brother without mentioning the perfume. He knew something about that jar. He just never says what, so let's do what the text lets us do. Let's put every reasonable possibility on the table, and let's be honest about which ones hold weight. If this is already changing how you see this story, do one quick thing. Subscribe and drop a comment below. Even one word. It helps more people find these studies, and we're only about a third of the way in. So, 4 possible answers. Let's take them honestly, weakest to strongest. The first answer. The family was simply wealthy. There's something to this. Watch how the household behaves. They own a house large enough to host a supper with guests reclining at table. Martha serves the meal, which means there is a meal to serve, in a village, days before a festival. Earlier, when Lazarus dies, John says many of the Jews had come from Jerusalem to console the sisters, a crowd traveling out from the city to mourn with this family. That's not how a village mourns a nobody. So this was not a poor household. Comfortable, connected, respectable. But comfortable does not cover this jar. A year of a working man's income in a single sealed flask of imported Himalayan nard is not middle-class comfort. That's a different order of thing. Even a well-off family in Bethany owns one of these, not several. And owning one means somebody made a deliberate decision once to turn an enormous amount of wealth into perfume, which means answer 1 doesn't solve anything. It just moves the question back a generation. Fine, they could afford it. Why did they buy it? The second answer. It was her dowry, her security. In that world, a woman's future was not held in her own name. It sat in her family, in a marriage contract, in whatever her household set aside for her, and a small, dense, storable asset was exactly the shape that kind of security took. Something you could carry. Something that held value across years. Something that didn't depend on a harvest. Under this reading, that jar was not decoration and not sentiment. It was the answer to the question every unmarried woman in that culture had to live with. What happens to me if this household fails? I'll be straight with you. The text never calls it a dowry. That's a reconstruction from what we know of the period, not a statement of John's. Hold it loosely, but if it's right, then when she snapped that neck, she was not pouring out a luxury. She was pouring out her own future in a room full of men in front of her brother. The third answer. She bought it after the resurrection. On purpose. For Jesus. This one has real appeal because it makes her the most deliberate person in the room. She watched a man call her brother out of a tomb. She went and spent everything on the one substance that says, I know what you are. And she waited 6 days for the right moment. But there's a problem. And it's the same problem the whole video has been walking toward. In a few minutes, we're going to look at what Jesus actually says about that jar. And the word he uses is not bought. It's kept, held onto, reserved, guarded. You don't reserve something you purchased last week for the express purpose of using it now. Which leaves the fourth answer. And this is the one the text keeps pushing us toward, without ever saying it. The perfume was already in the house before Jesus arrived. Because it had been bought for a burial, there had been a death in that family. There had been a body wrapped in linen and carried out and sealed behind a stone. And whatever a household like that spends on a grave, they spent, and then the grave gave him back. 4 days in, the stone rolled away, and a man walked out, still tied in his own burial cloths. The funeral was canceled after the fact. Everything bought for it, every arrangement, every provision, every purchase made in the worst week of their lives was suddenly for nothing, except it wasn't gone. It was still in the house, sealed, unused, and 6 days before Passover, a woman picks it up, walks into a room, and pours it over a man who is going to die on Friday. Now, is that what happened? I can't prove it to you, and I won't pretend I can. John never writes the sentence. This is inference, and I want you holding it exactly that loosely, but it is the only answer that explains all three things at once. Why the jar was in the house, why Jesus said she had kept it, and why John cannot introduce the sick brother in chapter 11 without mentioning the perfume that hasn't been poured yet. So let's go read that sentence, because Jesus does answer this question, and his answer arrives in the most broken piece of Greek in the entire Gospel of John. Judas objects. He puts a number on the perfume and asks why it wasn't sold and given to the poor. And Jesus answers him with one short line. Here it is in the King James, "Let her alone. Against the day of my burying hath she kept this." There's our word, kept. Te reo, just as I told you it would be. Now open a different Bible. The New International Version says, "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial." The English Standard Version says, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial." The New Living Translation says, "Leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial." The New Revised Standard says, "Leave her alone. She bought it, so that she might keep it for the day of my burial." 4 Bibles, 4 different sentences. One says she kept it. One says she bought it. One says somebody intended it. One drops the keeping entirely and just says she did this. That is not a difference of style. Those are different claims about what happened. So let's look at what's actually on the page in Greek. Word for word, the clause reads like this: "So that, for the day of my burial, she may keep it." And that sentence, read plainly, is impossible because she already poured it out. It's on his feet, it's in her hair, it's in the air of the room. There is nothing left to keep. Jesus cannot be telling the room to leave her alone so that she can save something that is, at that exact moment, gone. Scribes noticed this. Somewhere in the copying history, the difficult wording got smoothed. Some manuscripts drop one small word and change the verb to te reken, a past tense. She has kept it. Problem solved. She held on to it until today, and today she used it, clean, sensible, preachable. That's the reading behind the King James and the New King James. But it's the easier reading. And in this line of work, the easier reading is usually the one somebody made. Copyists smooth out difficulties. They very rarely create them. The awkward version, "so that she may keep it," is the harder text, and it has the stronger manuscript support behind it, which means the sentence Jesus' own gospel preserves is the one that doesn't quite make sense. So what do translators do with a verse that doesn't parse? They add words. This is the part I want you to sit with, because most people have never been told it. Look again at what those English Bibles are doing. The New Revised Standard inserts the phrase, "She bought it," a purchase that appears nowhere in the Greek of this verse. The New International inserts, "It was intended," an intention with no stated owner, which quietly makes God the one doing the intending rather than Mary. Some translators propose filling the gap with, "She did not sell it," answering Judas directly. None of those phrases are in the manuscripts. They are reconstructions, educated, careful, well-meaning reconstructions of a sentence that has a hole in it. And each committee patched the hole with a different piece of wood. I'm not saying your Bible is wrong. I'm saying that at this specific verse, your Bible is making a judgment call, and the footnote it puts at the bottom of the page is doing more work than most readers realize. And here is what nobody tells you from the pulpit. That patch is not neutral. It changes the answer to the question this entire video is asking. If the sentence means she bought it, then Mary went to a merchant, spent everything, and planned this. If it means she has kept it, then the jar was already hers, already in the house, already waiting. If it means it was intended, then Mary may not have understood what she was doing at all, and the intention belonged to someone above her. 3 completely different stories about where that jar came from, and the Greek won't tell us which one to pick, but strip away every patch and go back to the one word that survives in every single version, every manuscript family, every English committee's rendering: te rede, keep, guard, reserve, hold back for later. That word is stable. Nobody argues about it. Whatever else Jesus meant, he reached for the language of storage, of a thing set aside and held against a coming day. He didn't say she was generous. He didn't say she was extravagant. He said she was holding something, and that the day it was being held for had arrived. You don't hold something for a coming day unless you already know what day it is, and the family in that house had already had one of those days. It ended 4 days later with a shout at a tomb. Quick word before we keep going. What you're hearing here comes from hours in the Greek text, the manuscript variants, and the way different translation committees handled this verse. If that's worth something to you, subscribe and leave a comment. It genuinely helps this reach more people. Now here's what I didn't expect when I started digging into this. We laid out 4 answers. Family wealth, her dowry, a deliberate purchase after the resurrection, the leftover from a funeral. I went into this assuming the whole thing rides on picking the right one. It doesn't, because when you set them side by side and ask what each one actually means, they arrive in the same place. If it was the family fortune, then the jar was the reserve, the thing you turn back into money when the harvest fails, when the roof goes, when someone gets sick. It was the household's protection against the worst day. If it was her dowry, then the jar was her protection against the worst day. Specifically hers. The answer to, what becomes of me if this house falls apart? If it was bought for Lazarus's burial, then the jar was purchased on the worst day. It is what the worst day cost them, sitting in a corner of the house, still sealed. And even the 4th reading, that she went out and bought it after seeing her brother walk out of a tomb, lands in the same category, just from the other side. She spent the protection money. She turned her security into perfume on purpose. Every road ends at the same object. That jar was the worst day fund. Whatever else it was the thing that family held in reserve against disaster, and that reframes the whole scene. Because now watch what actually happens at that dinner. The worst day had already come to that house. A brother got sick, and the man who could have healed him did not come. He died. He was wrapped and carried out and sealed behind a stone. The sisters stood in a house full of mourners from Jerusalem, and the thing they had feared and saved against arrived anyway, and there was nothing in any jar that could touch it, and then it got undone. So by the time we reach chapter 12, this family knows something that almost nobody in the story knows. They have been to the bottom. They have found out exactly what their savings are worth against death. Nothing. The jar could not buy back 4 days. Which means that when Mary picks it up at that supper, she is not making a generous gesture with something valuable. She is getting rid of something she has personally watched fail. She learned, in the worst week of her life, that the worst day fund does not cover the worst day, and she is pouring it on the only person she has ever met who does. Look around that table one more time. Judas is doing arithmetic, 300 denarii, and he can tell you what it would have bought. He's not wrong about the number. He's wrong about the world. He is pricing an asset in a room where the asset has already been tested and already failed. And Lazarus is sitting there eating. The living proof. The man whose grave the money didn't stop. Mary is the only person in that house who has fully worked out what her brother's empty tomb means for her own savings. The jar is worthless, not because nard is cheap, because the thing it was saved for turned out to be something it could never buy. So she breaks the neck. Now put the two rooms next to each other. Room 1. A tomb outside Bethany. A stone, a body wrapped in linen, 4 days in. A family that has already paid whatever a grave costs. Room 2. A supper table, 6 days before Passover. Same family, same house, and the man from the tomb is at the table, reaching for bread. Between those two rooms, something got canceled. Death had a claim on that household, and it collected. It took the brother, it took the weak, it took whatever they spent on him. Then a man stood outside the tomb and called his name, and the claim was reversed, not paid, reversed. Everything death had taken from that family, it gave back, and the receipts stayed in the house. That's what the jar is. It's the receipt. Whether the family bought it for Lazarus's grave, or held it back for a grave that hadn't come yet, or set it aside years earlier for the day the worst thing happened, that jar exists because death exists. It is a burial expense. Its whole purpose is a body, and it never got used on one. The body it was meant for got up. So there it sits, in a house that no longer needs it, owned by a family that just watched its entire reason for existing get overturned in front of a crowd. And then Mary picks it up and pours it on Jesus. Understand what that is. She takes the one object in her house that death paid for, and she gives it to the man who canceled the debt. Not sold, not stored, not saved for the next funeral. And there would be more funerals. Lazarus would die again eventually. Everyone at that table would. She could have kept it for that. It would have been the sensible thing. She hands it to him instead. And then Jesus does the strangest thing in the whole scene. He takes this object, this leftover from a grave that emptied, and he points it forward. She kept it for the day of my burial. He doesn't accept it as a thank you for Lazarus. He doesn't take it as tribute, or as worship, or as payment for a miracle. He receives it as a burial expense, his own. Think about the direction that runs. The perfume was bought looking backward, for a death that had already happened, or for one the family feared. Jesus turns it around and aims it at a death that hasn't happened yet. His. 6 days out, on a Friday, outside the walls of Jerusalem. The jar changes hands and changes tense in the same motion, and there's a hard edge on this that the room could not have seen. Chapter 12 tells us that the crowds were coming out to Bethany, not only for Jesus, but to see Lazarus, and that the chief priests were making plans to kill Lazarus too. The man who came back had become evidence, and evidence has to be destroyed. So the resurrection that emptied one tomb was already filling out the paperwork for 2 more. That is the room Mary is standing in. Her brother is alive and marked. The man who raised him is 6 days from execution, and she is holding the family's insurance policy against exactly this kind of week. She breaks it open and spends all of it on the one person in the room who is going to need a burial and is not going to keep it. Let's finish the trail of that perfume, because it goes one place further than most people follow it. Friday comes. Jesus dies in the afternoon, and the Sabbath is starting at sundown, so there is no time to do the burial properly. The body goes into a borrowed tomb, fast. Sunday morning, women walk out to that tomb, carrying spices and oils. They are going to finish the job. They are going to do for Jesus what someone had done, or tried to do, for Lazarus. They never get to. The stone is moved, the tomb is open, and what they brought stays in their hands. So count the containers in this story. Lazarus's tomb, opened, emptied. The dead man walked out. Jesus's tomb, opened, emptied. The dead man walked out, and the jar, opened, emptied. and nothing came back. 2 graves in this account failed to keep what was put in them. 1 alabaster flask succeeded completely. It gave up everything it held, and it stayed given up. There is no version of this story where the nard comes back. That's the shape of the whole thing, and it's the exact reverse of what everybody in that room assumed. Judas looked at the jar and saw something permanent being destroyed. 300 coins gone forever. He looked at a tomb and saw something final. He had it backwards on both counts. The tombs were temporary. The pouring was the only permanent thing that happened that week, which is why Jesus says what he says about her. Wherever this good news is told in the whole world, what she did will be told with it. She is the one who understood that the jar was the perishable thing, and the grave was not. So, where did Mary get that jar? I've given you my honest answer. Somewhere in that household, somebody had turned a fortune into a burial expense, and death did not get to keep it, whether it was bought for Lazarus or set aside years before he ever got sick. The text won't finally tell us, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What the text does tell us, in a Greek word that survived every scribe and every translation committee, is that it was kept, held back, reserved against a day. And this is where I want to leave you, because there's a version of that jar in most of our houses. You have something you're keeping for the worst day. Everyone does. It isn't always money. Sometimes it's the conversation you're saving for when you finally have the strength, the apology you're holding until the timing is better, the thing you'd do with your life if you weren't holding it back, in case you need to fall back on it, the love you're rationing because you've been hurt before and you don't intend to be caught with nothing again. We call that being sensible. And it is, mostly. But that family found out something about the worst day fund. Theirs was full, sealed, ready. And the day came anyway, and it did not help. 4 days of it did not help, and then the thing they were saving against got reversed by someone who never asked for the jar at all. Mary didn't pour that perfume out because she'd learned that saving is wrong. She poured it out because she'd learned what it was actually worth against the thing she'd been saving it for. So the question this scene puts to you is not, are you generous enough? It's narrower than that, and harder. What are you keeping? And what do you think it's going to cover? The house in Bethany smelled like that perfume for days. It got into the walls, the cushions, the clothes. Long after the jar was empty, the fragrance was still there. That's the only thing in this story that never had to be given back. If this opens something up for you, help us get it to someone else. Subscribe, leave a comment, even one word. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you would, pray for us. God bless you.